Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you all here. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you and Rabbi Feinstein for joining us today. I want to thank our team, Bruce Fagan and Norwin Marins and Bob Watts for helping to put this together and to organize this. This couldn't have happened without them. And so thank you all very, very much. I want to remind everyone that we have some other wonderful programs coming up. I announced them in the chat box. They are there for you all to see. One is Rabbi Erez Sherman is going to be speaking about the Barron's Scholars Program over at Sinai Temple, which is about awareness and tools for high school students to combat anti-Semitism. And you can click the link and register there. And then also happening in January 5th, 2025, you'll see the registration link come out for that tomorrow or in this coming week for Dr. Karen McGinnity. She's going to be speaking. She's going to present her book, Marrying Out Jewish Men, Intermarriage, and Fatherhood. Book purchase is required for participation, and it's an excellent book and a wonderful conversation that we're going to have with her. I also want to remind everyone that we're in the midst of our end of the year campaign. The link there is also in the chat box. Contributing to that campaign helps to put on any number of wonderful programs for FJMC participants and men around the world to help them thrive in life and support their spiritual well-being. And shortly, we're going to get to our speaker, Rabbi Feinstein. Before we do, a few ground rules, which are now also in the chat box. Few ground rules. Rabbi Feinstein will speak, and once he has concluded his remarks, we will then take questions. Please remember to keep yourselves muted unless otherwise invited to speak by the host, which is me, or by Bruce. And if you have any praise, questions, or concerns, please forward them to nrauscher@fjmc.org, and I'll be happy to respond to them in a timely manner. Again, thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm now going to introduce our guest speaker of honor, who is also a mentor and teacher of mine, so this is a real personal honor for me to have Rabbi Ed Feinstein here. Elie Wiesel wrote that God created humanity because God loves stories. Rabbi Ed Feinstein loves stories too, and has spent his adult life sharing the stories of the Jewish people. Teacher, lecturer, storyteller, Rabbi Feinstein is rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, and lecturer at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies of the American Jewish University. He has served on the faculty of the Wexner Heritage Program, Milken Community High School, and the Chautauqua Institution, and the Shalom Hartman Institute. Raised in the back of his parents' bakery on the wild frontiers of the West San Fernando Valley, Ed graduated from the University of California at Santa Cruz, Columbia University Teachers College, and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, where he was ordained a rabbi and earned his doctorate in education. He was the founding head of the Solomon Schechter Academy of Dallas, associate rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel in Dallas, and executive director of Camp Ramah in California. He came to Valley Beth Shalom in 1993. Rabbi Feinstein is the author of 5 books, including Tough Questions Jews Ask, which is taught in schools and synagogues across North America. The Chutzpah Imperative traces the history of theological humanism in Jewish sacred literature. Capturing the Moon retells the greatest Jewish stories, and his latest book, In Pursuit of Godliness and a Living Judaism, is an intellectual biography of his mentor, Rabbi Harold Schulweis. Ed shares life with Rabbi Nina Bieber Feinstein, their 3 children and spouses, and 2 beautiful grandchildren. Every Friday afternoon, he bakes brownies from a recipe revealed to him from his ancestors at Mount Sinai. Without further ado, friends, I welcome you, my teacher, my mentor, my friend, Rabbi Ed Feinstein. Thank you for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. It's wonderful to be together. Thank you to Noam for this wonderful invitation, and thank you to all of you for giving up a bit of your Sunday afternoon to think together and to share together. I really want this to be more of a sharing than a lecture. That's one of the best things about Zoom. But it's wonderful to be together. Let me just present an idea, and then I welcome our conversation together. In about 1961, the Brandeis University Jewish history professor Simon Davidovich published a very, very important essay one of the seminal essays of the 20th century called The Ever-Dying People. And Davidovich argued that every generation of the Jewish people sees itself as the last. It sees itself as threatened. It sees that its children and grandchildren just don't take Judaism seriously the way our grandparents and great-grandparents did. And so every generation sees itself as just falling off a cliff. And certainly our generation is no different. We have this deep neurotic worry that our children, our grandchildren just aren't going to pursue Judaism the same way that we did or our ancestors did, and therefore the Jewish people is doomed. But what Davidovich notes is that generation after generation, this people isn't just the ever-dying people, it's an ever-renewing people. It's a people that has a particular talent for reinventing itself, for growing anew, for reimagining its institutions, restating its deepest core values, reinterpreting its purpose in the world, reasserting its mission in the world, and finding once again a different way, a new way, a shir chadasha, a new way to worship God. And it's a neurosis that's so deep in us that we forget that there's actually something quite remarkable about the persistence of this people. I'll give you an example. In 1964, April 1964, Look magazine, which at the time was the second most popular news magazine in America after Life magazine, Look magazine published a cover article called the Vanishing American Jew. And what happened, one of the senior editors went and collected all the extant data on Jewish demographics at the time, what was happening in Jewish communities. Remember, this is 1964, so this is really the advent of the third generation. If you imagine that most of us came between 1884 and 1920, the big immigration from Eastern Europe, and then you had a generation born native born, and there's a second generation native born generation, post-war Jews. Well, in 1964, he discovered that this third generation was losing its connection with its traditions, and what he predicted is that by 1980, there'd be very few Jews left in America, and by the turn of the millennium, there'll be almost none. He applied to this a sociological principle, which was actually not from Jews. It was a guy named Hansen had studied Swedish immigration in the upper Midwest, and discovered that the first generation comes from the old country and speaks Yiddish or Swedish or Vietnamese or Spanish or Italian and keeps the old ways. And the second generation is ambivalent. They want to become American, but they also want to honor their parents. So it's an ambivalent generation. The third generation feels invested in America, feels comfortable in America, and experiences the immigrant culture as a kind of kitschy kind of thing. And by the fourth generation, immigrants in America basically disappear. We have very few immigrant cultures that last after the fourth generation. If you go to Little Italy, there's very few Italians living in Little Italy, right? And there's very few Irish people living in Little Dublin or wherever you. These cultures, we intermarry and we become part of the American scene. But here's the crazy thing, and that's what the editor pointed out. He pointed out that by the time we hit our fourth generation, we're going to disappear. Well, here's the odd thing, ladies and gentlemen. Look magazine is gone, and we're still here, which is kind of strange when you think about this. Why are we still here? We have defied sociology. There's something about the tenacity of this people, its ability to reinvent itself, its ability to root itself, its ability to discover new sources of creative energy, spiritual resilience, and creativity, new sources in generation after generation that were not predicted by the sociology. And so what I'd like to suggest to you is just this big idea. When we think about Judaism in America, we think about Judaism in general, we pride ourselves on our continuity. We tell a story of continuity. We like to look at ourselves as part of a chain of tradition. It's no mistake that the first big song in Fiddler on the Roof is tradition, tradition. We like to see ourselves as part of a tradition. We like to see ourselves as accepting and carrying forward values, ways of thinking about the world, perspectives, beliefs, rituals that were given to us from Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron and David and Solomon and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hillel and Shammai and Rav and Abaye and the Rambam and the Baal Shem Tov, all the way down through Jewish history, down to our own generation. We root our authenticity in that chain of tradition. We root our authenticity in that sense that we have received from the past, and it is our deep, deep obligation, Vishinantam Livanecha, to move it forward into the next generation. And that's the source of the anxiety. That's the neurosis. Because how do I know that my kids are going to take this as seriously as I do? How do I know? And they don't seem to be nearly as invested as I am. And yet, here's the other truth about Jewish life. There is a contrapuntal narrative, a narrative that parallels that continuity narrative that goes all through Jewish history. And it's a narrative of discontinuity, which is to say that at certain key moments in the history of our people, events from outside or developments from within necessitated a rethinking of what it means to be Jewish, a reimagination of our mission, a reassertion of our values, a reinterpretation of our understanding of the God and the world, a reinvention of our institutions. And if you go through Jewish history, these events keep happening, and we keep arriving at the cultural creativity and spiritual tenacity to make these transitions. Now, here's what's remarkable about these moments of discontinuity. It takes a very special leader. It takes a very special mentality to carry forward a revolution of discontinuity, because it takes the kind of leader who's willing to say that what got us here is not going to get us there. A very special leader who doesn't want to close his or her eyes to what's going on around, but really is able to see that events have caused us, brought the necessity of reinvention and reinterpretation, of renewal, of doing things differently than my ancestors did. That takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of wisdom. You got to know what to change and what not to change and how to change it and the creativity to change it. That's what it takes in a moment of discontinuity. Now, here's the great secret, and I'll let you in on this one, but you kind of keep it a secret because it's important. All of the great works of our culture, all of the great books, did not come about in moments of continuity. They did not come about sort of in normal times. They came about out of the crises that we faced. That is, the great books of tradition came about in moments of discontinuity. The Bible is the product of Exodus from Egypt, and then the exile, the destruction of the Holy Temple, and the exile from Jerusalem in 586 by the Babylonians. And the Talmud comes about because of the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. And the great traditions of Jewish philosophy come about because of the invasion of Arabic Greek philosophy and the erosion of the cognitive foundations of Jewish life that was perceived by Rav Sadia and then the Rambam. And the Zohar, the great mystical text of Judaism, comes about because life in Spain in the 13th and 14th century became untenable, and they had to find a different way to be Jewish. And Hasidism comes about because of the great crisis of faith of the 17th century. And Zionism, which in many ways today is a kind of orthodoxy, that is to say, it's one of the ways we measure whether someone is really with us or not with us. Zionism was a complete revolution. It was a rejection of tradition. It's one of the reasons why the very Orthodox rabbinate, even to this day, doesn't accept the Zionist narrative, the creation state of Israel. Because Zionism was a revolt against tradition, and yet today it is the most traditional, it is the most powerful pillar and symbol of our life as a people. That is to say, discontinuity, moments of discontinuity, produce the great cultural creativity, the great works of cultural creativity of the Jewish people. Now, the reason I want you to know this is because we're going through a great moment of that right now. And I'll suggest 4 different levels of this. Level number 1, starting in the 17th, 18th century, the Jewish people ran into something called modernity. Modernity changed everything. It changed everything. We left the ghetto. We put on European dress. We entered into society. For Jews of Eastern Europe, they met modernity when they came to America in the beginning of the 20th century. And it changed everything about our Jewishness. It changed everything, and it demanded something completely new. I have interesting news for you. My Alta Zayda, my great-grandfather, who was a great Lithuanian Rav, didn't have a men's club in his shul. Right? This is an invention. I went to Camp Ramah as a kid. There was no Camp Ramah in Talmudic times. These were inventions of Jewish modernity. And then comes the 20th century. And the 20th century saw 2 great crises. The first great crisis, of course, is the Holocaust, which completely shook the foundations of Jewish faith and confidence. Our way of looking at history changed radically. And then, of course, the state of Israel. Now consider this for just a moment. The greatest moment of destruction in the entire history of the Jewish people was the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Romans. The Holocaust matches it or exceeds it. The greatest moment of redemption in all of Jewish history is Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. The creation of the state of Israel and all that it has done for the Jewish people matches it or exceeds it. The difference is that Yetziat Mitzrayim and Churban HaBayit, the exodus from Egypt and the destruction of the Holy Temple, took place 1,500 years apart. The Holocaust and the rise of Israel took place in 1 generation. And under the umbrella of Jewish modernity, when we already lost the apparatus of absorbing catastrophes and interpreting them, how the hell does a people make sense of this? How do you make sense of this? And I would add one more, which is not a crisis, but rather a gift. And that's the great gift of American democracy. Yes, I know. There's terrible anti-Semitism all around us. There's anti-Semitism on college campuses. There's anti-Semitism in the media. There's anti-Semitism God knows where else. But look, guys, even with this anti-Semitism, my life and my children's life is nothing like my grandfather's life. My kids never had to make a decision based on the fact that whether they were going someplace as Jewish. Now the only question is my grandson going to go to Harvard or Columbia, or am I going to keep him closer to home because of the anti-Semitism? You know, someone told me this funny joke that he said he had a dream and he saw Zayda, his grandfather, and he said, Zayda, there are Jewish kids at Harvard protesting against Israel. What am I going to do? And the Zayda said, there's Jews at Harvard? He says, there's Jews at Harvard. My God, there's Jews at Harvard. And they're protesting against Israel. There's an Israel? You understand where we are today with all of its challenges would be unbelievable to our ancestors. So American democracy presents another set of issues because by and large, they don't want to kill us. They want to marry us. That's remarkable. And then I would add one more layer to this sort of atmosphere of crisis that we're living in. Because the normal Jewish neurosis is, what am I going to do about my grandchildren? And then comes October 7th last year. And with October 7th and its aftermath, now we're facing a new situation, at least a new scenario. It's not new, actually. In some ways, it's a reversion to the classic story of Jewish history, which is it's just not so safe in the world to be Jewish. It's certainly not safe in Europe. And Israel is still Israel, but it's not so safe there. We'll hope that the latest events bring us some hope. And here in America, there's a rise of anti-Semitism, which is very, very concerning. There's no question. So we're at a moment that calls upon us to rethink what we're doing, to reimagine what we're doing, to reinvent our institutions. And I want to finish with that, because that's the part that bothers people the most. I mean, a rabbi is going to give an interpretation of Torah, and you're going to see young people flocking to synagogues that don't look like the synagogues our grandparents went to. As long as they go to shul, that's fine. But it's what happens when the institutional structures that we have become so used to begin to shake. begin to shake. I grew up in the conservative movement. Grew up in a conservative synagogue, went to Camp Ramah. There was a wonderful afternoon Hebrew school here called Hebrew High. I went to that. I went to what was then called the UJ. Now it's the AJU. I went to Neve Shechter in Jerusalem. I went to JTS for a very god-awful long time. And I was the director of Solomon Schechter Day School. I'm about as movement a guy as you're going to find. And yet, I see something in the conservative movement which leads me to wonder whether it's time to reinvent some of these institutions, seriously reinvent them, and to think in ways that we haven't thought before. And that's the gift of a crisis. It was the great Rabbi Bill Clinton who once said, "Don't let a perfectly good crisis go to waste," which is, let's use this as an opportunity to stimulate that amazing cultural creativity and spiritual resilience that has always characterized the Jewish people. And let's reinvent ourselves and think of some new ways to do this. I don't want to let go of Shabbos candles because I think that's the greatest thing Jews ever invented. And I happen to have a real fondness for Torah and Talmud and the great books of the tradition. But I read those books as rather revolutionary. And what I'd like to see is a reversion, a renewal, a recovery of the revolutionary spirit of those books that give us that permission to experiment, to innovate, to try something new, to experiment. Rabbi Rauscher was my student in rabbinical school, and one of the things I tell them is the first question you're ever going to get asked in an interview is, how are you going to bring the young people back to shul? But don't change any of the melodies of my synagogue, right? I'll let you. I want the young people back, but if you change Adon Olam, I'm kicking you out, Rabbi. It can't be that way. I mean, that's a joke, of course. Well, it's not such a joke, but we have to have a new spirit of experimentation and innovation. Conservative Judaism. I would have chosen a better title for it. I like to think of it rather as something called conservation, which is we'd like to hold on to the things that really matter, and at the same time acknowledge that the world around us and the world within us is changing. And that's where we are today. So I'm going to give you a gift. And I know it's really dangerous to do this because you're Jews and you want to hear bad news. Jews always want to hear bad news. It was the great Abba Eban who said Jewish people is the only people in the world refuse to take yes for an answer, right? The famous Jewish telegram is, start worrying, details will follow. I know you want to hear bad news, but I'm going to give you hope. Just a little. I don't want you to overdo it. I'm not going to I don't want you to get to overdose on this. But I want to give you a little hope. We have always had a remarkable ability to reinvent ourselves, to find new sources of inspiration, new sources of creativity, new sources of faith and spirituality. And I have every faith that God's not done with us yet. And that's why Look Magazine is gone and we're still here. I would be delighted to share the conversation with all of you now. Rabbi Rauscher, it's up to you.
Rabbi Feinstein, I think I speak for everyone in just saying thank you, Toda Rabbah. Thank you so much for those words of wisdom and that perspective. You're right. We had I was the one who thought of the title, so I take responsibility for its lack of creativity. But the question of the relevance of denominations is certainly on my mind. I think on others as well, and particularly on that within the conservative movement, as we are an organization that's always had roots within the conservative movement. And we're also curious about decline in membership and attendance in synagogue. And so the question really of the vitality of the conservative movement is on our mind as much as the future of the Jewish community in general. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure our conversation will unfold in that way. You speak of, all the discontinuity that has led to great innovations, right? Things that we've really needed. The pandemic was one of those. There was a lot of talk of should we digitize minyanim in some way to make it easier for people who can't necessarily come here physically to attend. And all of a sudden, that wasn't a question anymore. We had to do so. We had to think of different ways for people to gather because people wanted to come out of their homes in different way and be part of community. And it was so necessary. We couldn't use our traditional spaces to do so, right? Our legacy institutions that were meant for people to gather, we had to think outside of the box. It is to our credit that we are nimble in that way, of being able to be creative and reinvent ourselves. I really do appreciate your words of hope in that way in the end, how we have survived while as other institutions have not. Particularly knowing that there's anti-Semitism on the rise, and putting that in perspective for us, I think, is also really useful. Um, do you ever wonder about how Israel plays into this? That is to say, the conversation switches so drastically to Israel on everyone's mind, and it's so all-encompassing. Do you think there's a sense of victimhood related to that? Why can't we get past this, right, in certain ways and move on with other important things that are going on in the Jewish community? Why do we have to be so focused on what's going on with Israel?
Well, the short answer to your question is because October 7th was an earth-shaking event.
Yeah.
It was an earth-shaking event in Israel, and it's been an earth-shaking event for Jews around the world. And we're not finished with it. I mean, the Assad government fell last night.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a world-shaking event because it's, as if you read Tom Friedman's column this morning in the Times, Syria is the bridge between all of the factions in the Middle East, and we don't know what this new government's going to be.
Mm.
And it's another thing to both worry about and maybe be hopeful for. It's such a realignment, and what's happened. It's still an unfolding crisis, and so that
Yeah.
grabs us. The bigger issue, Noam, the bigger issue is what is Israel to us?
Yeah.
And so many of us have had a difficulty explaining to our kids why we're so emotionally invested in Israel. And I think it's because for our generation, for my generation, certainly for my parents' generation, Israel was the symbol of Jewish life. And it arrived at just the moment we needed that most. If you think about where the Jewish people was in April of 1945, when VE Day comes, when the war in Europe ends, and 6 million Jews have been murdered, 1 million Jewish children, millions of others are in DP camps all over Europe. There is just an incredible sense of, incredible sense of depression, of brokenness, that the Nazis had succeeded in doing is really breaking the spirit of the Jewish people. And that's why when Zionism rises after the war, it becomes the party of Jewish life. And Israel becomes the most powerful symbol that we are still alive. Am Yisrael Chai. And it has continued to be that for us. Now, it has worked beautifully for my parents' generation and for my generation. When I look at my children, they have a different attitude about Israel. First of all, the Israel they met wasn't the Israel of 1945 or 1948 or even 1967, which was my Israel. It's the Israel of 1982 and beyond, when Israel becomes a power in that part of the world. And they expect something different from Israel. So what I would suggest is that it's time for a rebirth of Zionism. I think, again, use this crisis as an opportunity. And what I'd like to suggest is something really nuts, which is let's stop thinking of Israel as a symbol, and let's start thinking of it as a real place with real people. And let's stop, and it still is a symbol, don't get me wrong, but I have a friend, for example, who's a Francophile. He's a crazy Fabrent lover of France and French culture and French food and French wine. And he speaks French and he reads French and he goes to France every year. And I don't understand why my Fabrent Zionist friends don't feel the same way. How can you be an American Zionist and not read Hebrew?
Right.
And how can you be an American Zionist and not listen to the music that Israelis are listening to? I mean, because of Netflix and a couple of other outlets, we can now get Fauda and Shtisel on our televisions. Great, wonderful, mazel tov. Now we can actually begin to see what Israelis watching on TV 3 years ago. But I think it's time to really engage Israeli culture and bring Israelis here, and we go to Israel. I mean, what if American Jewish communities start saying, let's send every American Jewish family to Israel for a couple of weeks a year. Let's send American Jewish kids as they grow up to kindergarten in Israel so they'll really speak Hebrew and read Israeli literature and enjoy Israeli TV and film. Let's engage with the real Israel and not just the symbol of Israel. I mean, it's great to go to Israel and take the tour and get on the bus and go to the Kotel. But that's not the real is. That's it's like when you live here in L.A. I live in L.A. And I see people on the bus going around Hollywood and Beverly Hills. That's not where I live. I think we should get off the tourist track and actually have roots in that country and participate in its culture. Learn its language. Learn its language, not just Hebrew, but learn the language of its literature and the language of its film and the language of its food and the language of its cult of its the rhythms of its culture, and really engage in Israel and let our kids enjoy that, because there's something remarkable, just remarkable about that culture. And when our kids do get into it, they get so committed. They absolutely get so committed. And that's what's so beautiful about this.
Rabbi Feinstein, can I challenge you respectfully for a moment? Which
You
is,
can challenge me irrespectively. It's okay.
okay.
You always
So
have before, Noam.
I
Why,
appreciate it.
why tonight
Well,
should be any different?
we're in public now, so
Yeah, but we're friends.
Um,
Come on.
okay. Anyway, I'm totally in agreement with this idea of falling in love with Israel through its culture, through its wisdom, and all the beauty that it has to offer, and really getting to know it beyond a tourist relationship. You talk about this idea of not treating Israel so much like a symbol, right, and really treating it for like the real country that it is. When I
Right.
was studying in Israel, I came to the notion of treating Israel like a country and not a cause in that way, right?
Perfect.
Zionism became a cause, and I think for my generation, it's much more of a country. Zionism is much more of an idea as opposed to a way of life or a belief system for my generation.
Hmm.
And so I wonder where that divide actually looks, just deeper in terms of if we're going to have a further or an expansive conversation about it. But I also wonder, is it possible to really be a Jew, right, and to enjoy the diaspora? Right, which is to say that like Israel's a great place to visit, and I'm happy to go there and indulge in all the Jaffa oranges I want and read all the, Yehuda Amichai poems I want, sitting on the Kotel steps, right, basking in the same sunlight as King David. I would love to do that for my children to do it, but you know what? I also really like American life, and I like being American, right?
And so let me interrupt you for a second.
Yeah,
And the other half of my proposal
okay,
is to bring Israelis here. I think we need reverse birthright. I think we need to take as young Israelis, maybe during their gap year. They all do gap year now before they go into the army, right? In that maybe for 3 weeks in their gap year, and they come and live in America. They come because when Israelis come to America, they discover a kind of Judaism that they don't know in Israel. They walk into my synagogue and they say to me, "Mazeh." What? Because for them, a synagogue is a place
right,
of prayer and maybe a little Talmud shiur.
right,
They never saw a synagogue with a Tai Chi class at 7 o'clock in the
right,
morning. A
right.
synagogue with young family programming. A synagogue with culture. And I say to them, "Merkaz Kilati." It's a cultural center. It's a community center, and they come to enjoy it. When we bring kids to Camp Ramah or any of the Jewish camps, the URJ camps across the country, and Jewish kids get to see it, it's a remarkable experience. And we do bring a few of them. These Shinim are coming now. The kids are graduating and they come for a year. But I suggested this should become a mass program, because we do have something in diaspora, which they don't have in Israel. And they have stuff in Israel, which we don't have here. And what I'm suggesting is breaking down that cultural wall. Breaking down that cultural wall as an affirmative action so that we can begin to be Am Echad im Lev Echad, one people with one heart. You're exactly right, Noam. You're exactly right. Judaism is not just a national movement to create a country. Judaism is an answer to the great questions of human existence, the great questions and dilemmas of the human condition. Read Heschel. That's what the whole thing is about. And that's exactly what we teach. And if we get too Israel centric, you're right. We lose that question of who are we as a people, as human beings. I think that we need to break down these walls and really celebrate both cultures and bring them together.
So pivoting from that and talking about bringing different cultures together, one of the central questions about the conservative movement is, what is our real relevance today? Will we eventually merge with the reform movement in the next generation? And particularly also, how do we respond to the question of intermarriage, which seems to be growing and becoming a much more popular concept? also being defined in different ways. We think of the idea of intermarriage being people of two devout faiths joining together and trying to make it work. Whereas we know there's a greater spectrum and a nuance out there to those relationships, which is to say that some people don't identify as religious at all and they're married to a Jewish person. So to say that they're interfaith doesn't really make any sense to them whatsoever. But nonetheless, the conservative movement has typically done a bad job at outreach and engagement of interfaith families, which is something that's very important to, the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. And I also think to the future of the Jewish community in general. I don't mean to drop this kind of grenade-like question in your lap, but that really is to say, what are we going to do about intermarriage?
I'm a congregational rabbi. I'm used to fielding
No, I
grenades.
know that. Valley Beth Shalom does a lot of innovative stuff and has in the past with making things.
So let me answer all three of your questions in order, right?
Right.
I think we need to make a distinction between conservative Judaism and the conservative movement. Conservative Judaism is an idea. It's an idea that the Jewish tradition has developed historically over time, and we can trace that development. And once we trace that development and understand it, we can become conscious in shaping a Jewish religious culture that really fits the moment. And we don't have to be bound to the ways that our ancestors did things before just because they did it before. We are bound to those things our ancestors did because they are deeply valuable to us. And the things that aren't deeply valuable to us, we have to adjust to the language and moment of this idiom. I just had a bar mitzvah kid. I think you were in shul. And a bar mitzvah kid who got up and gave his bar mitzvah speech about AI. He said, there's a lot of commandments in the Torah. I think we need to have 10 commandments for AI. And the kid I worked with him on his speech, and he's a brilliant kid. Whoever thought of that? That's brilliant. That's conservative Judaism at its best. Now, here's my insight about that, if it's okay with you. We won. Let's declare victory. We won. The Reform movement was once a rejectionist movement. So much of Reform Judaism has returned to tradition because they accept our premise that there is something deeply valuable to be conserved in tradition. Walk into a Reform temple on a Friday night. The service is in Hebrew. People are wearing yarmulkes. The rabbi and cantor are wearing talesim. It's remarkable. It's just remarkable how where the Reform movement has come, because they've adopted the conservative ideology that there are certain forms of Jewish life, Jewish ritual life, and spiritual life which need to be preserved and protected. And the Orthodox movement, I got news for you. There are women Orthodox rabbis today. Some of them don't call themselves rabbis; they call themselves Rabbah or some other title. But there's a yeshiva marat which is ordaining them. Yes, there is ultra-Orthodoxy, and they're a whole different ballgame. But in the modern Orthodox world, they've accepted conservative Judaism too. So let's wave the flag and declare victory. In terms of conservative movement, however, our institutions need a big overhaul. A big overhaul. I spent a lot of time working with the United Synagogue. I was one of those rabbis that took on the task of trying to reform the United Synagogue some years ago. And what I discovered is that the institutions of the conservative movement were put together, they're like tinker toys. There's no design, right? And it's a mess. And I think that it's high time that we think about where we need to streamline and remodel this kind of, get Elon Musk to come do it for us. Streamline it, Department of Conservative Movement Efficiency, and try and figure out a better way to organize our institutions, to raise money and to spend our money, how we support our institutions here and in Israel and across the world. Yeah, our institutions, our synagogues, our movement, our national institutions need a lot of reformation, a lot of recovery and reform and remodeling. But the question of intermarriage, which is your third question.
I have one more after this.
Well, I got plenty more answers.
Good, fine.
You're right. This is the greatest challenge. This is the curse and the blessing of American democracy. You understand that I'm not advocating intermarriage, so please don't take this the wrong way. But in a culture, the greatest compliment that a majority culture can pay to a minority is to allow them to intermarry. If they hated us, if they thought we were genetically inferior, if they thought we were religiously anathema, they wouldn't let our kids marry their kids. This is the acceptance. This is the very acceptance that my grandparents and your grandparents prayed for We want our kids to be Americans. Well, mazel tov. They're so American, they married Americans. This is what they prayed for. Now we got it. Now we got to figure out, how do you maintain an ideology? How do you maintain a theology? How do you maintain a religious commitment and a cultural and a spiritual commitment in an atmosphere where so many of our children marry people who weren't raised that way? Now, sometimes they marry people who are attached to their own religious traditions. It's true. Sometimes you'll have a Jewish kid who'll marry a kid who's a church-going Catholic or a church-going Protestant, sometimes even a Muslim or a Buddhist. That happens. But the majority of these American kids are faithless. It's not an interfaith marriage.
Right.
It's an interfaithless marriage.
Right.
And there's an opportunity. And I don't understand why our movement, well, the men's club's actually done it because your predecessor really took this seriously. There's an opportunity to open a door and say, come in, you're welcome. Ask them, what can we do to make you feel more comfortable? I'll just tell you a silly story. My nephew was my wife's nephew. It's not my fault. My wife's nephew married a beautiful, beautiful Thai woman. She's a gorgeous woman. He finished his training, went across the country, lives on the East Coast, right? So they have two little kids, two little daughters. And they decided, because the best nursery school in the area was the synagogue, or the JCC rather, they sent the kid to the JCC nursery school. A lovely thing. I mean, this nephew never had any connection with Jewishness, but listen, it was close by and it was a good price and it's a great school. So then our niece, his wife, the woman who's Thai, calls us one day and says, Uncle Eddie, the kids came home with a challah and they want to make challah. You have a good recipe for challah, I remember. Can you send me the recipe for challah? So I said, sure. So I sent her the recipe for challah, and we also sent her the instructions on how to make motzi at the table. Then she calls back and says, the kids came home from school. They want to light candle Shabbos. Can you help us with that? So we sent them candlesticks and candles and a book on how to do it. The whole shebang. We even sent them a Kiddush cup. And then she says, Uncle Eddie, how do I get him, the Jew, to come home from work on a Friday afternoon so we can have a Shabbos dinner because the kids want to have a Shabbos dinner? Now, this is a woman who is not, in any stretch of the imagination, halakhically Jewish, and yet she's the one who's bringing the family back to some Shabbos observance and tradition, because you know what's going to happen after Shabbos observance. Then they're going to want, Hanukkah, and they're going to want Pesach. And this poor kid, my nephew, is going to discover that he's going to have a Jewish home before he knows it. Now, there's a lot of stories like this. Open the door. Open the door. Make them feel comfortable. Listen to the language we use and make sure the language is not excluding. Watch the way we do prayer and let prayer be authentic but also engaging and open and welcoming. This is what we've got to do. And here's the other little thing, Noam. Because of October 7th and because of this rise of anti-Semitism, we have a Tat Shabbat at VBS. You can't get in. There's 400 people there. And when I asked these young people, where is this? She said, Rabbi, I've never been very Jewish in my life. But after all this stuff going on, I just want to be here. It feels comfortable. I think this is an opportunity for our institutions to really go on a campaign of Keruv and find those people ready to bake challahs and make Shabbos and decorate a house for Hanukkah, step by step by step, to bring them home.
I appreciate the image of you talking about Tat Shabbat and all those people there, those young families in particular, which is a central question to any Jewish community. How are we going to get the young families in without changing who we really are? But I love you that you've left us with that image. And that was the question that was also on my mind. You gave a sermon, I think you and Rabbi Farkas gave a sermon several years ago. It was framed as a form of a conversation between a parent and child that, it was letters that was left on the seats of the congregation. And so you guys were reading it for everyone. And it was a great conversation between an older generation, a younger generation, how it has changed. And Israel was the primary question, right?
It was one of the, no, not all. No, actually, religious authenticity was the primary question.
Right.
The kid said, I'm sick of the formality of your synagogue. I want something which touches me. So and the father said, this touches me, but you go find something that touches you.
Right. So this is what I'm imagining. You know, how you have all these families here for Tat Shabbat, and at Shabbat, and you have all these, current members who are veterans of a long generation of dedication to the congregation. They come together, in a Shabbos meal. What do you imagine that conversation actually looking like in terms of the way they want the community to shape up and change so that it is a space for all of them?
Well, the first thing we got to know is when can I reach them? If I have an adult education class on a Wednesday night at 7:30, I'm not going to get young parents of young kids. They're not going to come. They're
Yeah.
either putting the kids to bed or they've put the kids to bed and they're exhausted. Right? So what do I got to do? I got to record that class, put it up online as a podcast, and let this poor schnook who has to drive from my neighborhood into LA, let him listen to it in his car on the way into town. I have to find different modes and modalities for reaching the community that I want to reach. They are thirsty for learning, Noam. They want to know Torah. They want to know what this tradition is. They want to know why why we are so engaged in it. They want to know, and I'll give you another just a crazy. Here's a crazy thing. You look for an idiom. You look for an opening, right? What's the most spiritual moment of the day for a parent of a little kid? Going to sleep at night. In my house, it was called special time. So you know what we did? We did this many, many years ago. We bought a bunch of old airline pillows. Remember airline pillows? And we got special printed pillowcases that have Shema on one side and Moda'ani, the morning prayer, on the other side. And the kids decorate them. And we have a workshop with parents. They say, this is the Jewish way to put a kid to sleep. PJ Library has all these books. Now you can say a prayer with your kid. Now you can talk about God with your kid because there's no better time to talk about God than when you're snuggling in bed at the end of the day. So
Okay,
these
good.
are these are these are ways of reaching a generation, but in
So
a different way.
So let's talk about men then for a moment, because you're great at, from a grandfather's perspective, talking about how to put kids to bed. But let's also talk about men who aren't really coming to synagogue life unless they're dragged there for some type of particular reason, right? And
Mhm.
who the only reason they tend to show up for programming has to do with either sports or bourbon, right? Or steak or some kind of supernova combination of the three of them. What can we do to really best engage men in that way?
Here at our shul, I'm sure many other places do this. We had a club called Torah and Tequila. Now it's called Mitzvahs and Margaritas or something like that. It's got a nice. You're going to attract a guy with a steak and a cocktail, but that doesn't mean that's the end of the conversation. I think men today, when they feel safe
Yeah.
and are prepared to be a little vulnerable, are willing to confess that they have the same anxieties that generations and generations and generations of men have had. I want to protect my family. How do I make my kids good people in a very, very immoral world? How do I find God? How do I find a sense of transcendent meaning? It can't just be get up in the morning, drive to work, come home, work out, put the kids to bed, get up, go to work. It's got to be something else. There's got to be something else. The need for transcendence, the search for meaning, the desire for something more out of life than just material prosperity is very, very powerful in the lives of men of all ages, by the way. We just have to provide the right setting for guys to be able to say that. And they're not going to say it with women around. I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be sexist, but I know guys well enough. Men are not going to confess their vulnerability. They're not going to
Right.
confess their anxieties, their existential anxieties, when they're women and their wives especially. But you put a bunch of guys in a room, and the first question you ask, you want an exercise if you haven't done this? Put a bunch of guys in a room, give them a piece of paper, tell them, write down your Hebrew name. Right? I'm Yitzchak Moshe ben Dov Yosef, right? I'm Isaac Yitzchak ben Dov, my son of Dov Yosef, right? Tell me, how are you the son of Dov Yosef? You
We
want to watch
recently
a
did a
bunch of guys
program like
start
that,
crying?
actually.
You want to watch a bunch of guys start crying? It's the most amazing thing in the world. Tell me who your dad is or was, and tell me what he taught you, and tell me what you learned, both positive and negative, from your dad. And tell me how you're the same man as your dad, but you're different than your dad. Tell me how you're different than your. I'm telling you, Noam, I've seen guys, the strongest, most just at that moment start to weep because they say, yeah, I don't want to end up like my dad. I love my dad. I love him. What he did for me, unbelievable gift. I don't want to let him go. I can't live his life. I have to live a different life. What do you want for your children? Men are prepared to have that conversation and need it. Synagogues, however, aren't built for that. We don't have the patience and the time and the attention. You know,
But do you think that some of it is also that so much of synagogue life is also rote, right? And that what we like is
yeah.
also so comforting. So is there something lacking in really kind of our ritual that on a tribal level would be far more inspiring and engaging than what we currently offer?
Look, the other thing. Look, there's a whole movement right now. There is a crisis in American masculinity,
Yeah.
right? And there's books being written, there's articles, there's more women, many more women now in college than there are men. There are women reaching the upper echelons of corporate leadership, and men are feeling threatened. I mean, there's a cultural crisis going on, right? I mean, part of this, I don't want to get political, I don't mean that, but part of this last election was a revolt of young men against a culture which didn't give them a way in. I mean, there once was a time when when there was a clear definition of what it meant to be a man. I grew up with that. You grew up with the movies that were clear definition. Now, what does it mean to be a guy? Like, what is expected of me as a guy? And how do I feel valued and worthy, and that I have fulfilled my obligations as a man, as a responsible man? These are deep questions of American masculinity, and the Jewish tradition has a whole lot to say about this
I
stuff.
completely
And
agree.
by the way, the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, your book, the Hearing Men's Voices, the stuff that you guys have been putting out is so valuable. It's so valuable. It's just, we got to get serious, and we got to get serious to offer these kinds of opportunities. And yet, sometimes it's going to take a lure. So you know what?
Fair enough.
You lure them with a good bottle of single malt scotch, and you'd be surprised how wonderful a conversation can come from that.
I so very much appreciate your suggestion about talking about fathers. That was actually a program that we did twice already that we plan to do more called Introduce Your Dad. It's specifically that. You stand in a group of 10 men and you stand there with a chair and you stand beside it and you talk about your father. And it's
We need
non-judgmental. It's everything as much as you want to share, thoughts and opinions, memories and stories, whatever it is. Rabbi Feinstein, I can't thank you enough for this wonderful conversation. It's really been amazing. We look forward to so many more opportunities with you, but I want to thank you again for giving us your time and giving your wisdom. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us out there over in the Zoom space. We very much appreciate your time and attention. In the chat box, again, you'll see the announcement for 2 more speaking engagements coming up in our Spotlight Speaker Series. One with Rabbi Erez Sherman coming up on December 12th, and one with Dr. Karen McGinnity coming up on January 5th. And please also consider giving to our end of the year campaign to support programs like this and many others which are there to support men and their spiritual well-being. Rabbi Feinstein, thank you. Toda rabah. Everyone,
Happy Hanukkah to everybody. Take care.
happy Hanukkah. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Take care.